In the year 1857, Elijah Anderson was a name whispered through the streets of Philadelphia, a leader in the fight for freedom and a symbol of hope for many enslaved people. His movements were discreet yet profound, spreading through the underground channels of the abolitionist network. As an influential figure in the fight for the emancipation of African Americans, his presence was felt in every major abolitionist gathering, and his strategic contributions were invaluable. But one fateful day, Elijah Anderson, a man who had guided so many toward a future of freedom, simply vanished from the records of history. It was as if he had never existed. This unsettling disappearance has puzzled historians for decades, leaving a hole in the very fabric of the abolition movement's history. Anderson was not just a minor player, he was pivotal, a leader whose actions had shaped many lives. Yet, no one truly knows what happened to him. Did he vanish by design, hiding away for some greater cause? Or was his disappearance the result of something darker, an unseen force that pulled him from the world he once knew? The truth remains unknown, buried beneath a veil of silence that even the most dedicated historians have struggled to lift. What is known, however, is that Anderson's sudden and mysterious disappearance left those who knew him shaken to their core. There was no body found, no trail to follow, no clues left behind. All that remained were the fragmented memories of his associates and the chilling whispers of those who feared the truth would never be revealed. Many who had worked closely with Anderson, including well-known figures of the abolitionist movement, recall the strange events leading up to his disappearance. Some remember seeing him in public just days before he vanished, his usual confident demeanor replaced by an unsettling aura of dread. There were reports of cryptic conversations, late-night meetings, and a marked change in his once steadfast belief in the cause he had fought for so long. Was there something more to this than just a man fading into obscurity? Elijah Anderson was not an easy man to forget. His presence was magnetic. He had a way of inspiring those around him, urging them toward a common goal, sharing in the belief that freedom was something worth fighting for. His disappearance was not only a personal loss for those who had known him, but it was also a loss for the larger cause that seemed to lose its momentum the moment he vanished. His name was spoken of with reverence, but it was also spoken of with caution. For those who dared to ask too many questions, the silence surrounding his fate became a shield, a way of keeping people from digging too deep into a mystery that had plagued the nation's conscience for years. In the days and weeks following his disappearance, there was an eerie quiet that settled over Philadelphia. Friends and comrades in the abolitionist movement tried to maintain the fight, but something had shifted. The absence of their leader, someone they trusted implicitly, cast a shadow over their work. The optimism they once shared now felt hollow, as though the very foundation of their beliefs had cracked. As time passed, those who had worked with Anderson moved on with their lives, and the movement continued, though it would never be the same. But there were always whispers. In taverns and private meetings, in letters and journals, people would occasionally speak of the strange disappearance of Elijah Anderson. Yet, no one ever really knew what had happened. His name slowly began to fade from the history books. Official records would later brush him aside as if he had never truly mattered. How could a man who had fought so hard for freedom simply vanish without a trace? His story, once so vibrant, now seemed lost to time. But the more the years passed, the more people began to wonder if there was something more to this story. Could it be that Anderson had simply walked away from the life he had built? Had he grown tired of the constant battles, the endless demands on his energy and his spirit? Or was there something darker at play, something that no one dared to speak of? Perhaps it was a conspiracy, orchestrated by powerful men who sought to erase him from history. The idea that a man like Elijah Anderson, a man so intertwined with the abolitionist cause, could be silenced so completely seemed impossible, yet it had happened. Perhaps it was the political climate that led to his disappearance. The struggle for abolition was not a simple cause, and the closer Anderson got to the heart of the movement, the more dangerous his work became. It's no secret that the fight for freedom wasn't just a battle between enslaved and free people, it was a war that involved power, money, and the very foundation of the American social order. Perhaps Anderson's disappearance was more than just a personal tragedy. Perhaps it was a calculated move, orchestrated by those who stood to lose the most if his influence continued to grow. But if this were the case, why was there no trace of foul play? No body, no trace of violence, no hint of a struggle. The lack of answers only deepened the mystery surrounding Anderson's fate. It wasn't just that he had vanished, it was how he had vanished. People in his circle, from fellow abolitionists to political allies, were left with only questions. Did Anderson leave because he feared for his life, or was there a deeper reason for his disappearance? Was it simply a personal breakdown, or did something more sinister lie behind the scenes? Over the decades, the questions surrounding Elijah Anderson's disappearance have only grown. And though his story has faded from public consciousness, there are still those who wonder what truly happened to the man who once stood at the forefront of the abolitionist movement. His absence from history is not just a gap in the timeline of events, it is a haunting void that no one has been able to fill. In many ways, the mystery of Elijah Anderson is a reflection of the larger mysteries that have always surrounded the abolition movement itself. How much of the history of the fight for freedom has been lost, erased, or manipulated over the years? And how much has been hidden by those in power who sought to keep certain stories buried? Elijah Anderson's life, his work, and his legacy, shaped by struggle and sacrifice, are now bound in mystery, leaving behind a question that has yet to be answered: was his disappearance part of something much larger than a single man's life? The eeriness of his vanishing continues to haunt those who dare to look back at the history that was never fully told. And as more people begin to ask the questions that were once silenced, there is a growing sense that the truth about Elijah Anderson may yet be uncovered, though the path to it may be far darker than anyone could have imagined. The mid-1800s was a time of intense upheaval in the United States. Slavery, a deeply entrenched institution, was coming to a head, with tension between the North and the South escalating toward a bloody conflict that would ultimately result in the Civil War. It was against this backdrop that Elijah Anderson emerged, a figure whose contributions to the abolition movement would shape the lives of countless people. But to understand his disappearance, one must first understand the world he inhabited, a world full of contradictions, where hope and darkness coexisted in a delicate balance. Anderson was born in the early 1800s, during a time when slavery was still widespread in the southern states, but the winds of change were beginning to stir. The abolitionist movement had gained significant momentum in the North, fueled by figures like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and William Lloyd Garrison. Yet, the fight for freedom was not simply a matter of ideals or moral arguments, it was a battle against a system that had been built on the exploitation and oppression of millions. The divide between the free states and the slave states was growing wider, and the issues surrounding slavery were beginning to bleed into every aspect of American society. Elijah Anderson was one of the many who sought to bridge this divide, though his contributions to the cause were often less visible than those of other prominent abolitionists. He was not a household name in the way that Douglass or Tubman were, but he was known to those who mattered, leaders of the Underground Railroad, key abolitionist figures, and enslaved people who dreamed of freedom. He was a leader of extraordinary resolve, someone whose quiet but steadfast efforts contributed to the liberation of many. Yet, as significant as his work was, it was also fraught with danger. His position as a conductor on the Underground Railroad placed him squarely in the crosshairs of those who sought to maintain the status quo. Philadelphia, where Anderson lived and worked, was a city on the edge. The bustling metropolis was situated in the north but had a significant southern influence due to its proximity to slave states. The city's role in the abolitionist movement cannot be overstated. It was a hub for abolitionist meetings, a place where ideas about freedom and human rights were debated fiercely. However, the atmosphere was one of tension. The streets of Philadelphia were filled with both abolitionists advocating for emancipation and pro-slavery sympathizers pushing back against the growing abolitionist sentiment. In this volatile environment, Anderson worked tirelessly to help enslaved people escape to freedom, guiding them along the perilous paths of the Underground Railroad. But Anderson's work went beyond merely transporting slaves to safety. He was also a strategist, a man who understood that the abolitionist cause was not just about freeing individuals, it was about dismantling the entire system that perpetuated slavery. He worked in secrecy, organizing covert meetings, creating safe houses, and establishing secret networks that helped runaway slaves navigate the treacherous journey to freedom. His influence was widespread, and many believed that his network was one of the most effective in the entire abolitionist movement. Yet, despite his success, Anderson's contributions were rarely recognized in mainstream historical accounts, and his name, though respected, never quite achieved the fame of some of his contemporaries. There was something understated about him, something that drew people in without ever making him the center of attention. Perhaps it was his quiet determination, or perhaps it was the mysterious aura that surrounded him, an aura that would later become even more pronounced after his disappearance. Anderson's life was not just about politics or the fight for freedom, it was also about personal sacrifice. Like many abolitionists, he faced constant threats to his safety. The risk of being caught by slave catchers or vengeful slave owners was ever present. Anderson's work was illegal in the eyes of the law, and every time he helped a slave escape, he was putting his own life on the line. Yet, despite the risks, Anderson pressed on. His belief in the cause was unwavering, and his commitment to helping others was profound. For him, the work was not just a political or social obligation, it was a moral calling, something that transcended all else. But while he was dedicated to the abolitionist cause, Anderson was also very much a product of his time. The tensions of the era were reflected not just in the political landscape but in the social fabric of society. Slavery was not just a distant issue, it was woven into the very identity of the United States. The economy of the South depended on slave labor, and even many in the North, though opposed to slavery, were complicit in its perpetuation. The question of abolition was one that divided families, communities, and even entire states. It was not simply a matter of right versus wrong, it was a question of power, economy, and identity. And for someone like Anderson, who walked the line between these two worlds, it was a constant struggle to remain grounded in his beliefs while navigating the dangerous currents of society. Philadelphia, with its mix of pro-slavery advocates and abolitionists, was a particularly perilous place to be an outspoken leader in the movement. While Anderson worked alongside other prominent abolitionists in the city, there were constant threats to his safety. The city was a battleground of ideologies, where meetings were often interrupted, and the stakes were always high. The Underground Railroad was not just a network of paths and safe houses, it was a symbol of resistance. But that resistance was often met with violence. Anderson's role in this movement made him a target, not only for slave owners but also for those who sought to suppress the growing tide of abolitionist sentiment. The political climate in the North was also complicated. While the northern states had abolished slavery in their territories, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had ensured that enslaved people who escaped to the North could still be captured and returned to their owners. This law, which effectively rendered the North unsafe for runaway slaves, created a climate of fear and uncertainty. Anderson's work in Philadelphia, which was supposed to be a safe haven, was constantly under threat from law enforcement and slave catchers. Yet, despite these dangers, he persisted. His network continued to operate, and many enslaved individuals found their way to freedom thanks to his efforts. Yet even as Anderson fought for freedom, he was also caught in the web of contradictions that defined the period. The very nature of the struggle for abolition was filled with paradoxes. The fight for human rights was tied to a system that oppressed so many, and the push for freedom was not without its own set of challenges and compromises. Anderson, like many others, had to navigate these complexities. He was not a saint, but he was a man deeply committed to his cause. And it was this commitment, this unyielding dedication to the cause of freedom, that would define his legacy, though it would not be one easily understood by those who came after him. In the years following his disappearance, historians would attempt to piece together the life of Elijah Anderson. Yet, despite their efforts, much of his story remains elusive. The complexity of the times, the dangers of his work, and the sheer magnitude of his contributions make it difficult to understand just how profound his impact truly was. Anderson was a man of his time, a time marked by uncertainty, division, and strife, but he was also a man who defied the odds, working tirelessly to ensure that others could live free. His story, though shrouded in mystery, is a testament to the unsung heroes who worked quietly behind the scenes to bring about monumental change. And it is in this world of contradictions and conflict that Anderson's life, and disappearance, becomes a symbol of the larger struggle for freedom that defined the era. As Elijah Anderson's influence grew, so too did the peculiarities that would come to define the months leading up to his mysterious disappearance. Those who were close to him began to notice strange behaviors, subtle shifts that seemed out of character for the strong, resolute leader they had known. At first, these signs were small, barely noticeable to the casual observer, but to those who had worked alongside Anderson for years, these anomalies were troubling. What had once been a steadfast commitment to the cause of freedom now seemed overshadowed by an increasing sense of confusion and unease. The first of these changes was the way Anderson began to withdraw. He had always been a man of action, someone whose very presence in a room could inspire those around him to take bold steps in the pursuit of freedom. But gradually, those who were closest to him began to see him retreat from the very networks he had built. Where he once eagerly attended clandestine meetings, helping to plan safe escapes for runaway slaves, he began to shy away from organizing them. There were reports of him arriving late to meetings, leaving early, and in some cases, not showing up at all. Those who spoke with him during these moments noted a distinct absence in his demeanor. His usually sharp mind seemed to be clouded, as if lost in thought, distant from the task at hand. But perhaps the most unsettling change was the look in his eyes. Those who had worked with him, trusted him, spoke of a subtle, yet undeniable shift in his gaze. They said it was as though his eyes were no longer fully present, as though something, or someone, had taken residence within him. It was a look that spoke of fear, doubt, and uncertainty. And the more people saw this change, the more they began to question whether Anderson was truly the man they had once known. Some of his closest confidants began to suspect that he was hiding something from them, something that perhaps even he couldn't quite understand. One of the most troubling signs came from his behavior during the planning of an important rescue operation for a group of runaway slaves. Anderson had always been the architect of these operations, coordinating safe houses, routes, and ensuring that those seeking freedom would have the best chance of escape. But when the time came for him to give a detailed briefing for an upcoming operation, he failed to arrive on time. Instead, he sent a cryptic message to those waiting for him: "I must stay hidden for a time, for the eyes are upon me." This odd statement left those who received it confused and concerned. Anderson had never been one to act out of fear, his courage had been one of his defining characteristics. So why now was he speaking in such strange terms? What had changed in the time since they last worked together? When Anderson did finally show up, it was clear something was different. His presence was no longer commanding, it was more subdued, as though he was carrying a weight far heavier than any burden he had ever known. Some attributed this to exhaustion. The ongoing fight for abolition was a relentless, unyielding cause, and the toll it took on its champions could be immense. But others suspected that it was more than just physical fatigue. There was a palpable tension in the air whenever Anderson spoke now. His words were less certain, less confident. He began to rely more on others, asking for input from his fellow abolitionists when, in the past, he had been the one everyone turned to for guidance. This shift in Anderson's behavior was not limited to just his professional life. Even those closest to him began to note changes in his personal interactions. His once strong relationships with his allies began to show signs of strain. Conversations that had once been filled with camaraderie and shared purpose now felt strained, with Anderson speaking in disjointed sentences or, at times, lapsing into silence altogether. Those who knew him best described it as if he were being haunted by something, or someone, that they could not see. His interactions with people became distant, almost mechanical. His family, in particular, was deeply affected by these changes. Anderson's wife, a strong and supportive figure in her own right, was the first to notice the signs of inner turmoil. She had always been the grounding force in his life, the one person he could rely on when the weight of the abolitionist cause became too much to bear. But recently, she had begun to see him withdrawing from her as well. He became preoccupied with strange thoughts, constantly pacing the house late at night, muttering to himself about forces he could not name. At first, she chalked it up to the stress of their work, but soon, she could not ignore the deepening sense of dread that seemed to have taken hold of him. She feared that her husband was unraveling in front of her, his once unshakable resolve now fractured. There were also reports of Anderson being seen at unusual hours in places where he had never ventured before. He was spotted on several occasions visiting obscure locations in the city, places that were not part of his usual network. These visits were brief, often occurring under the cover of night, and no one could ever say for sure who he was meeting or what business he was conducting. It was as if he were seeking something, though no one could determine what that might be. He had always been a man of purpose, but these late-night excursions left many questioning whether he had become involved in something far more dangerous than the fight for abolition. The most disconcerting event occurred when a fellow abolitionist, who had been working alongside Anderson for years, found him in a secluded alley late one evening. The man, whose name was Samuel Ward, had been following a trail of rumors about Anderson's increasingly erratic behavior. When he confronted Anderson in the alley, he was struck by the odd, almost trance-like state in which his friend appeared. Anderson was standing with his back to Ward, staring at the shadows as if waiting for something, or someone. When Ward called out to him, Anderson turned slowly, his eyes wide with a look of sheer panic. He muttered something about being pursued by forces unseen, and then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he turned and disappeared into the night. This event left Ward shaken. He knew Anderson well, and he had never seen him like this before. The calm, confident man who had once inspired so many was now a figure gripped by fear, as though some dark force was closing in on him. Ward attempted to follow him, but Anderson was gone, swallowed by the night, leaving behind only more questions and a growing sense of unease. Anderson's behavior became even more erratic in the days that followed. Those who continued to work with him tried to reach out, to understand what was happening, but Anderson only seemed to pull further away. He became less communicative, more withdrawn, and those who had once been part of his inner circle found themselves increasingly shut out of his plans. A man who had once worked tirelessly alongside them now seemed to be operating in isolation, his motivations unclear, his actions more unpredictable by the day. What had happened to Elijah Anderson? What had caused the once indomitable leader to fall into such a state of fear and confusion? Was it simply the pressures of the abolitionist cause wearing him down, or was something more insidious at work? Those who had once stood by his side were left with only uncertainty. Anderson had always been a man of clarity and strength. Now, in the face of something unknown, he seemed to be unraveling. Something had shifted in him, and whatever it was leading him down a path from which there was no return. As the days turned into weeks, the signs of Anderson's unraveling became impossible to ignore. The man who had once led with such certainty was now a shadow of his former self, and the mystery surrounding his strange behavior only deepened. Those who had witnessed these anomalies could not shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, but no one could say for sure what it was. All they knew was that something dark had taken root in Elijah Anderson, and it was driving him to the edge of a precipice from which he might never return. As the strange and unsettling behavior of Elijah Anderson began to spread among his closest allies, it was not long before whispers of his peculiarities began to reach the ears of others in the abolitionist community. The first witnesses to speak out were those who had known him best, the individuals who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with him in the fight for freedom. These were the people who had helped him build his network, who had been present during countless midnight meetings, who had seen his passion and his unwavering commitment to the cause. To them, Anderson's behavior was not just an anomaly, it was a mystery that needed to be unraveled. The first significant testimony came from Sarah Fisher, a young abolitionist who had worked alongside Anderson on multiple occasions. Sarah had always admired Anderson's resolve, his clarity of purpose, and his ability to inspire others with his vision of a free future. But in the weeks before his disappearance, Sarah had noticed that something had shifted in him. She remembered their last conversation vividly. Anderson had arrived late to one of their meetings, his eyes wide, as though he had seen something that no one else could. When Sarah asked him what was troubling him, he had simply shrugged and said, "It's the darkness closing in." At first, Sarah had dismissed his words as the stress of their work weighing heavily on him. The abolitionist cause was a relentless struggle, after all, and anyone involved in such a dangerous movement was bound to feel the pressure. But Anderson's subsequent actions left her with an uncomfortable feeling in her gut. He had grown increasingly distracted, arriving at meetings with papers that seemed out of order, his usual sharp mind clouded by some unseen force. There was something unsettling about the way he would look over his shoulder as though he were being watched, a nervous energy that hadn't been there before. One of Sarah's most chilling memories came from a night when she and Anderson were supposed to meet with other abolitionists to finalize a plan for an escape route. Anderson had arrived alone, and there was something about him that made Sarah uneasy. His normally composed presence was now erratic, and when he spoke, his words were disjointed, as though his mind was somewhere else entirely. He mentioned that he had seen someone, lurking in the shadows. "They know what we're doing," he said. "They're coming for us." Sarah had tried to reassure him, but the fear in his eyes was undeniable. She had seen Anderson in the heat of battle, had witnessed his courage in the face of violence, and had never once seen him display such fear. The man who had once stood so resolutely for the cause now seemed to be retreating into a space where no one could reach him. This unsettling change in him was becoming impossible to ignore. But it wasn't just Sarah who noticed this. Word soon began to spread among their circle that Anderson's behavior was growing more and more erratic, and whispers of his strange actions became more frequent. James Blackwell, another prominent abolitionist in Philadelphia, was one of the first to take notice of Anderson's increasingly bizarre conduct. James had worked alongside Anderson on several rescue operations, and the two had forged a strong bond of trust. James was the type of man who never feared a fight, who always kept his cool no matter the danger. But when he began to observe Anderson's behavior, even he was unnerved. It was one particular evening that James would remember for years to come. He and Anderson had planned a secret meeting with a group of runaway slaves who were to be guided along a safe route to Canada. They had met at an abandoned warehouse on the edge of the city, a place they had used before to coordinate such operations. Anderson was supposed to arrive first, but when James got there, he found the place eerily silent. He waited for what seemed like an eternity, his mind racing with questions. When Anderson finally arrived, it was late, and he seemed disoriented. His clothes were rumpled, his face pale, as though he hadn't slept in days. Anderson didn't apologize for his tardiness, which James found odd. The man was always punctual, always precise. But instead of explaining himself, Anderson merely said, "They're coming. We have to move faster than ever." His tone was low and urgent, as though there were some unseen danger lurking just beyond the horizon. Anderson's words were not those of a seasoned abolitionist, but those of a man on the verge of losing control. He paced the floor of the warehouse, muttering to himself, as though he were hearing voices only he could understand. James had tried to calm him down, asking him to focus, but Anderson's gaze had turned cold, distant. "You don't understand," he had said. "You don't understand what's coming." Those words, haunting and cryptic, would echo in James's mind long after that night. What had Anderson meant? What was he seeing that no one else could? As the days passed, more and more individuals came forward with their own strange encounters with Anderson. Each story seemed to mirror the others, a man once filled with purpose and clarity, now lost in a fog of fear and confusion. Several abolitionists who had worked with Anderson on the Underground Railroad reported that he had become increasingly secretive. He was no longer willing to share the details of their operations, and he seemed to be working alone, isolating himself from his former allies. Some whispered that Anderson was losing his mind, that the weight of the cause had finally become too much for him to bear. Others speculated that something more sinister was at work. Had Anderson become paranoid, or was there a deeper reason for his erratic behavior? Was he being followed, hunted by forces far beyond his control? The rumors began to swirl, and with each passing day, the mystery surrounding Anderson's actions deepened. But despite the growing number of witnesses, no one seemed to have any answers. No one knew what was happening to the man who had once been a beacon of hope in the abolitionist movement. Those who cared about him were left in the dark, unable to help him, and unable to understand what had caused his transformation. The most troubling part of it all was the fact that Anderson himself seemed unaware of the gravity of his situation. He had always been a man of great clarity, someone who understood the stakes of the fight for freedom better than anyone. But now, he appeared to be lost, adrift in a world that was slipping beyond his grasp. One of the last individuals to witness Anderson before his final disappearance was his old friend and confidant, Richard Lawson. Richard had known Anderson since their youth, and the two had fought side by side for the cause of freedom for many years. But when Richard met with Anderson in the days before he vanished, he was struck by the profound change in his friend. Anderson was not the man he had once known. His eyes were dull, his voice hollow. And when Richard asked him what had happened, Anderson had simply responded, "I'm no longer who you think I am. I've seen things, Richard. Things that will never leave me." Richard tried to comfort him, but the words seemed to fall on deaf ears. Anderson was beyond reach, trapped in some unseen torment, a man who was no longer in control of his own fate. And when Richard left that night, he had no idea that it would be the last time he would ever see his friend. Elijah Anderson, the great leader, the abolitionist hero, had disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and the chilling whispers of those who had witnessed his unraveling. The mystery of Anderson's disappearance was now firmly planted in the minds of those who had once followed him, and it would haunt them for years to come. No one could explain what had happened to him, and no one could understand the strange events that had preceded his vanishing. All they knew was that Elijah Anderson was gone, and with him, a crucial piece of history had been erased. As the rumors of Elijah Anderson's disappearance spread, the reaction from the public was a mixture of disbelief, confusion, and, for some, outright denial. The abolitionist movement, which had once been united under the banner of freedom, now found itself fractured, with Anderson's vanishing becoming a controversial and uncomfortable subject. Many people, particularly those who had worked closely with him, were initially reluctant to acknowledge the strange events that had led up to his disappearance. It seemed too absurd, too unimaginable, that a man who had stood as a pillar of the abolitionist cause could suddenly unravel in such a mysterious way. It was easier, in many ways, to pretend that nothing had changed, that the same unwavering leader they had known for so long was still out there, fighting for the cause. But reality would not be ignored for long. The first signs of public denial came from Anderson's closest supporters. Prominent figures in the abolitionist movement, such as fellow leaders and activists who had worked alongside him for years, were hesitant to speak openly about the strange circumstances surrounding his vanishing. Many believed, perhaps out of respect or out of a need to preserve the sanctity of the movement, that Anderson's disappearance was something best left unexamined. If they acknowledged his erratic behavior, his uncharacteristic retreat from the cause, they feared they might undermine everything they had fought for together. The abolitionist movement had already faced intense opposition from pro-slavery factions, and the idea that one of their own could collapse in such a public manner threatened to destabilize the credibility of the entire cause. So, they remained silent, hoping the mystery would fade into the background as other battles took precedence. Among the public, especially those who had admired Anderson from afar, the idea of a man so revered by many simply disappearing was too hard to grasp. Anderson had been seen as a symbol of strength, a person whose courage and unwavering commitment had inspired thousands. For someone so integral to the movement, the absence of any clear explanation seemed almost unthinkable. Instead of grappling with the true nature of his disappearance, people began to latch on to more comforting, albeit far-fetched, explanations. Some suggested that Anderson had suffered a mental breakdown, a casualty of the psychological strain caused by his relentless fight for freedom. This theory, though plausible to some, lacked the complexity to explain his sudden and complete disappearance. If he had broken down, surely there would have been some trace of him, some sign that he had suffered from a physical or mental ailment. But no such signs appeared, and the absence of any evidence only made his disappearance all the more mysterious. This denial, however, was not just limited to those within the abolitionist community. As the news of Anderson's disappearance spread, certain factions within the religious community began to weigh in, offering explanations that strayed far from the realm of reason. Some religious leaders, particularly those who had long been suspicious of abolitionist efforts, saw Anderson's behavior as a divine judgment. For many, the abolitionist movement, with its radical ideas of equality and freedom for all people, was an affront to the established social order. These religious figures, some of whom had been active supporters of slavery, found in Anderson's sudden unraveling a form of divine retribution. They claimed that his disappearance was a sign from God, a warning against the push for abolition, and evidence that the fight for freedom was a misguided, even sinful, endeavor. One such preacher, Reverend Isaac Holden, a staunch pro-slavery advocate and a powerful voice within certain religious circles, openly declared that Anderson's behavior was a clear manifestation of spiritual punishment. God has shown us the way, Reverend Holden preached from his pulpit, and those who challenge his will, those who seek to overturn the natural order of society, will face the consequences. Elijah Anderson has been struck down for his rebellion against divine law. This idea of divine punishment, though rooted in ignorance and bigotry, gained traction among those who were already hostile to the abolitionist cause. For them, Anderson's strange behavior and eventual disappearance were not signs of mental illness or political pressure, they were signs of a righteous punishment. The spread of this religious explanation was not limited to the more extreme factions of society. Even among more moderate religious communities, there was a tendency to dismiss the significance of Anderson's vanishing. Many believed that his strange behavior was merely a manifestation of personal weakness, a failure on his part to withstand the immense emotional toll of the abolitionist struggle. They viewed his disappearance not as a mystery, but as the result of a man succumbing to stress, his mind and spirit fractured under the weight of his own ideals. This line of thinking allowed people to maintain a sense of control, to believe that the course of history was still unfolding according to predictable patterns. It also allowed the movement to continue without confronting the uncomfortable reality of what had happened to one of its most respected leaders. Even within the abolitionist ranks, some began to distance themselves from the mystery. The fear of public perception, the desire to protect the reputation of the movement, led some to downplay the significance of Anderson's disappearance. Leaders who had once been close to him now found themselves struggling to explain his absence without acknowledging the deeper questions it raised. Some suggested that Anderson had simply chosen to go into hiding, perhaps for his own safety, after becoming a target of pro-slavery forces. But this theory, too, was insufficient. If Anderson had feared for his life, why had he not left a clear message, a trail to follow, an explanation for why he had vanished? His disappearance was not the kind that could be easily explained away, but the community, both abolitionists and outsiders alike, had a deep-seated need to rationalize it. The religious and societal pressures surrounding Anderson's disappearance led to a kind of collective amnesia about the man himself. It was as though, by refusing to confront the uncomfortable reality of his fate, they could preserve the myth of the abolitionist hero. Anderson became a symbol, a larger-than-life figure whose complexities were flattened into a simple narrative of courage and righteousness. And yet, in trying to protect his legacy, those who had once known him were inadvertently contributing to the erasure of the very man he had been. His disappearance was not just a personal loss, it was a blow to the movement that had shaped his life, and by refusing to confront the truth, they allowed the mystery to fester in the shadows. In the years that followed, Anderson's name became a subject of hushed conversations, a legacy wrapped in silence. No one dared to speak too loudly about what had happened, for fear of reopening old wounds or disrupting the delicate narrative that had been carefully constructed. The abolitionist cause, still fighting for justice, continued its struggle, but it did so without the man who had once been one of its most influential figures. Anderson's absence was like a ghost haunting the movement, an unresolved question that lingered in the background, rarely addressed but never forgotten. And so, the story of Elijah Anderson became something of a paradox. He was a hero whose actions were celebrated, but whose personal story was suppressed. His disappearance, an event that should have been examined and understood, was swept under the rug, buried beneath layers of denial and religious justification. The abolitionist movement, for all its progress, could not bring itself to confront the truth of one of its own, choosing instead to maintain the myth of a leader who had disappeared without a trace. And in doing so, they allowed the mystery to endure, a lingering question that would never fully be answered. As the months passed following Elijah Anderson's disappearance, the ripple effect of his strange behavior and sudden vanishing began to spread throughout the abolitionist community, growing into a silent but undeniable force. What began as a quiet concern soon transformed into a more widespread sense of unease, even panic. Those who had known Anderson personally, and those who had fought alongside him for the cause of freedom, began to question whether something far darker had been at play than anyone had initially realized. The psychological toll of his disappearance was becoming apparent, not just for the individuals closest to him, but for the broader network of abolitionists who had relied on his leadership and guidance. For many of Anderson's allies, the unsettling nature of his disappearance was compounded by the knowledge that they had failed to recognize the warning signs in time. They had been too focused on the larger fight for freedom, too immersed in the struggle for emancipation, to notice the subtle unraveling of the man who had been one of their most trusted leaders. As they reflected on the last months of his life, they began to understand just how much of an emotional and psychological toll the abolitionist movement had taken on him. But this realization was too little, too late. The damage had already been done. The first signs of this psychological unraveling had been dismissed as nothing more than stress or exhaustion. Elijah Anderson had been, after all, at the forefront of the abolitionist cause for years. The constant pressure of working in secrecy, of leading rescue missions, and of confronting powerful enemies would undoubtedly take its toll. But as his colleagues began to reflect on his final days, they began to see the pattern emerging: something far more insidious was at play. Anderson's gradual retreat from the abolitionist efforts, his cryptic statements, his apparent paranoia, and his eventual disappearance all seemed to speak to a growing psychological collapse, one that had been building quietly over time. For some, this collapse was framed as a form of trauma, the result of the mental and emotional strain of living in a world so deeply divided, where the constant threat of violence, betrayal, and failure weighed heavily on the hearts of those fighting for freedom. The abolitionist movement was not only a political cause, it was an ideological one, a battle against a centuries-old institution built on the dehumanization of millions. Those who participated in it knew the stakes were not just political, they were personal, deeply rooted in an understanding of justice and morality. The weight of that knowledge, of fighting against an oppressive system that seemed so entrenched, could break even the strongest minds. Anderson's disappearance, in many ways, was a manifestation of this emotional and psychological burden. The growing psychological impact was not just confined to those closest to Anderson. His absence created a void within the abolitionist community, one that was felt by many. Anderson had been more than just a leader, he had been a symbol of hope, a beacon for the cause. His sudden and unexplained departure left behind a profound sense of disorientation, especially for those who had followed him for years. For some, it was as though a light had gone out, leaving them in the dark. Many began to question their own resolve. If Anderson, a man of such courage and determination, could fall victim to fear and psychological collapse, then what did that say about the movement as a whole? Was it possible that the entire cause could eventually be consumed by the same forces that had claimed their leader? Among the abolitionists who had worked most closely with Anderson, the impact was particularly profound. His disappearance cast a long shadow over their personal lives, leaving them in a state of deep uncertainty. They were left to wrestle not only with the loss of a dear friend and comrade, but also with the failure to understand what had been happening to him. There was guilt that they hadn't seen the signs, guilt that they hadn't been able to intervene in some way to prevent his downfall. And for many, there was a creeping fear that his fate might one day become their own, that they, too, might succumb to the same psychological toll of fighting a seemingly unwinnable battle. For some, the fear that had begun to haunt Anderson began to spread to them as well. They started to experience feelings of paranoia, a sense that their own lives were at risk, just as Anderson had seemed to feel in his final days. The growing anxiety among Anderson's closest allies became almost palpable, as though they, too, were living under the shadow of an invisible threat. They had been part of a movement that had long been under siege, but now it felt as though the walls were closing in on them in a more personal way. It wasn't just that they feared losing the war for freedom, it was that they feared losing themselves in the process. This psychological contagion spread throughout the abolitionist ranks, affecting not only those who had known Anderson personally but also others who had been indirectly influenced by his work. The community began to fracture in subtle ways, as individuals started to question their own commitment to the cause, their own mental and emotional well-being. It was as if the disappearance of their leader had exposed a hidden vulnerability, one that they had not fully understood until it was too late. The psychological impact of Anderson's vanishing was now rippling outward, creating a sense of unease that threatened to undermine the very foundations of the movement. The absence of answers only exacerbated the growing psychological tension. Without any concrete explanation for Anderson's disappearance, people were left to fill in the gaps with their own interpretations. Some believed that he had been driven mad by the pressure of the cause, while others feared that something more sinister had occurred. The lack of closure allowed people's fears to run wild, leading to speculation that Anderson had been the victim of foul play, or that he had been forced into hiding by powerful enemies. And then there were those who whispered about darker forces at work, supernatural forces, perhaps, that had driven Anderson to the brink of madness. The fear of the unknown became all-consuming, and with it, the psychological toll of the movement grew even greater. As time went on, the emotional and psychological impact of Anderson's disappearance became an unspoken burden for many within the abolitionist movement. His name was mentioned less frequently, his story growing quieter as new figures and new battles took center stage. But for those who had known him, his absence remained a haunting presence, one that lingered in the background of their lives. The psychological scars left by his disappearance were not easily erased, and for many, the trauma would never fully heal. The memory of Elijah Anderson, once a symbol of strength and hope, had now become a symbol of something else, of the price that had been paid for fighting an impossible fight, of the emotional toll that even the most resolute leaders could suffer. It is in this psychological landscape that the true cost of the abolitionist movement begins to come into focus. The struggle for freedom was not just a fight against slavery, it was a fight against a system that sought to break the spirits of those who challenged it. And for Elijah Anderson, a man who had dedicated his life to that cause, the price was perhaps too high to bear. His disappearance was not just a loss of a leader, it was a loss of innocence, a reminder that even the strongest, most committed individuals could be consumed by the very forces they sought to fight. The psychological impact of his vanishing reverberated through the abolitionist community, leaving behind a legacy of fear, uncertainty, and unresolved trauma. As the mystery surrounding Elijah Anderson's sudden disappearance deepened, so too did the attempts to rationalize and explain the enigmatic events leading up to his vanishing. In the absence of clear answers, the public, the abolitionist community, and even some scientists and intellectuals began to search for plausible explanations, anything that could offer a sense of understanding and closure. Theories emerged in a wide range of directions, from the psychological to the scientific, each attempting to make sense of a situation that defied any simple or straightforward answer. However, despite the numerous attempts to dissect Anderson's behavior and disappearance, the truth remained elusive. One of the first and most widely discussed theories was that Anderson had succumbed to the intense psychological and emotional toll of his work as an abolitionist. The pressure of the movement, the constant danger of being hunted by pro-slavery forces, the physical and emotional strain of participating in an underground movement that required secrecy and deceit, these factors were seen as contributing to a potential mental breakdown. Anderson, once the epitome of strength and resolve, had become a man visibly haunted by fear and paranoia. His increasingly erratic behavior, his withdrawal from the cause, and his cryptic statements about being pursued by unseen forces were taken as evidence that the relentless pressure of his mission had broken him. For many, it seemed plausible that Anderson had simply lost his mind. Psychologists and mental health professionals of the time, however, had their own theories. Some suggested that Anderson was suffering from what they called combat fatigue, a condition that was beginning to be recognized among soldiers and those involved in prolonged, high-stress environments. The symptoms, extreme paranoia, disorientation, withdrawal from reality, and delusional thinking, seemed to align with what those close to Anderson had witnessed in his final days. This theory argued that Anderson's long-term involvement in the abolitionist movement, combined with the ongoing stress of being in constant danger, had left him psychologically scarred. The emotional weight of witnessing injustice on such a massive scale, coupled with the fear of retribution from powerful enemies, could have caused a slow mental deterioration. Yet, even those who considered this explanation found themselves struggling with the inconsistencies in Anderson's behavior. His sudden disappearance, without a trace, without any warning, seemed to contradict the idea of a man who had simply cracked under pressure. If Anderson had indeed suffered a mental breakdown, surely there would have been more signs leading up to it. His disappearance was not the slow burn of a deteriorating mind, but a sudden, unexplained vanishing, as though something or someone had swept him away. If he had been trying to escape from the pressures of his life, why had he not left a letter, a message, any indication that he was retreating from the world? His lack of a clear goodbye, or any communication at all, left many to question whether the mental breakdown theory truly explained everything. Another scientific theory that began to gain traction was the idea that Anderson may have been suffering from a form of physical illness or neurological disorder. Some suggested that his erratic behavior and paranoia were symptoms of a medical condition that had gone undiagnosed. The possibility of a brain tumor, an early onset of dementia, or a rare neurological disorder that affected his mental state was proposed by several doctors and medical experts. This theory sought to explain Anderson's increasingly strange behavior, his disjointed speech, his tendency to withdraw from those closest to him, and his obsession with being followed or watched. Medical professionals speculated that a tumor or other neurological condition might have caused a gradual breakdown in his cognitive functions, leading him to act in ways that were completely out of character. While this theory seemed reasonable to some, it too left many gaps. If Anderson had indeed been suffering from a physical illness, why had no one noticed the signs earlier? His behavior had been so out of step with the man they had known, but there was no indication that he had been physically ill in the days leading up to his disappearance. Those who were close to him would have noticed a decline in his physical health, especially since his sudden mood shifts and lapses in judgment were so stark. Furthermore, the notion that a medical condition could explain his disappearance, without leaving any trace of evidence or a note of explanation, felt insufficient to many. There was no clear explanation for how a person could go from being so active and engaged in the abolitionist cause to suddenly vanishing into thin air. As the debate raged on among intellectuals, another theory gained momentum within the abolitionist community itself. Anderson's disappearance was part of a larger political maneuver. Some suggested that he had been forced into hiding by powerful pro-slavery factions who were aware of his pivotal role in the abolitionist movement. Anderson, they argued, had been targeted by enemies who had the resources and the motivation to remove him from the picture. The theory postulated that his strange behavior was an attempt to cover his tracks, to disguise his movements and make it appear as though he had lost his sanity, when in reality, he was hiding to avoid capture or assassination. This explanation found some support among those who were particularly attuned to the dangers that abolitionists faced during this volatile time. The threat of violence and retribution from pro-slavery groups was real, and it was not outside the realm of possibility that Anderson, in his heightened state of paranoia, had chosen to go underground in order to protect himself and his allies. However, there were significant issues with this theory as well. If Anderson had been in hiding, why had he not communicated his whereabouts or plans to those he trusted? Why had he not reached out to the people who depended on him for guidance and leadership? His disappearance, coupled with his apparent emotional and psychological breakdown, did not fit the profile of a man on the run. If he had been trying to outmaneuver his enemies, why had he not left any clues or signs behind to indicate that he was still alive? The complete absence of any contact, the lack of any effort to maintain his cover, made this theory hard to accept for many of Anderson's allies. As the theories continued to swirl, some of the more outlandish explanations began to surface, some even hinted at supernatural causes. Several individuals, particularly those who had known Anderson in a more religious context, suggested that his behavior and disappearance were the result of spiritual forces beyond human comprehension. Some believed that Anderson had been cursed, that his struggle for freedom had somehow angered powerful forces in the spirit world, and that he had been taken as a result of that anger. Others, more mystically inclined, suggested that Anderson had been called by some higher power to fulfill a different, more spiritual purpose, and that his sudden disappearance was the result of a divine intervention. This theory, though based more on faith and superstition than evidence, found traction in certain circles, particularly among those who had become disillusioned by the lack of answers. The idea of a supernatural cause offered a certain comfort. If Anderson's disappearance was the result of forces beyond human control, then there was no shame in not understanding it. It was not something that could be reasoned with or solved through scientific inquiry. For many, this provided a way to cope with the deep loss they felt, allowing them to hold on to the idea that there was a higher meaning behind Anderson's fate, even if it remained forever hidden from their view. Yet, as the years passed and no answers came, the theories surrounding Elijah Anderson's disappearance began to lose their force. The scientific explanations, the political theories, and the supernatural speculations all failed to provide the resolution that so many desperately needed. Anderson remained gone, his fate still a mystery, and those who had once fought alongside him continued their work without him, haunted by the unanswered questions that had followed in his wake. Each theory that had been proposed was based on fragments of truth, yet none seemed to capture the full scope of what had happened to Anderson. And so, the mystery endured, unresolved and unanswerable, leaving behind only a legacy of confusion and a growing sense of loss among those who had known the man who had once been their hero. As time wore on, the mystery surrounding Elijah Anderson's disappearance did not fade, rather, it deepened, and the sense of dread and confusion grew. The initial shock of his vanishing had slowly given way to an unsettling realization among those who had known him best. Elijah Anderson, once the unshakable leader of their cause, was gone, and no one could make sense of where he had gone or why. The abolitionist movement, once so driven by purpose and unity, began to unravel in the wake of his disappearance. A quiet, pervasive sense of collapse set in as allies, colleagues, and even close friends tried to piece together the fragments of a man who had become a shadow of himself. Anderson's physical absence left behind an emotional void, one that threatened to dismantle the unity of the movement and sow doubt in the hearts of those who had once looked to him for guidance. In the months following his disappearance, many of Anderson's closest allies tried to rally, to push forward with the cause they had so fervently believed in, but they found it difficult to overcome the weight of the unresolved mystery. Anderson had been their cornerstone, the person who had inspired them to continue the fight when it seemed impossible. But now, without him, there was no clear leader to take his place. The network of abolitionists had been thrown into disarray. The individuals who had once followed Anderson's lead were left to question not just his fate, but the strength of their own commitment to the cause. If their most steadfast and visionary leader could suddenly disappear without a trace, could anyone truly escape the same fate? In many ways, it was as if Anderson's disappearance had revealed an underlying fragility in the abolitionist movement. Beneath the courageous exterior, beneath the speeches and the carefully organized operations, there had always been a fear, a quiet understanding that their work was dangerous, perhaps even unsustainable in the long run. Anderson had been the glue that held much of it together. His charisma, his ability to inspire, his unwavering faith in the ultimate victory of the abolitionist cause had given others the strength to persevere. Without him, that faith seemed to flicker and die. The abolitionists who had once worked with him began to question whether they were fighting a battle they could ever win, and whether they could even trust their own judgment anymore. Some of those closest to Anderson, including those who had shared his vision of a free nation, began to isolate themselves. Unable to deal with the mystery of his disappearance or the emotional burden of the loss, many withdrew into themselves. The circles of activists that had once flourished with passionate discussions, strategic meetings, and coordinated efforts began to shrink. People avoided speaking of Anderson altogether, afraid that his name would bring back painful memories or uncomfortable questions that no one was ready to answer. The abolitionist movement became a shadow of its former self, its leaders hesitant to move forward without the man who had once been its driving force. And as the months turned into years, the fervor that had once characterized the movement began to dissipate, as if Anderson's absence had caused the very energy of the cause to evaporate into the air. The emotional collapse among Anderson's followers was paralleled by a more tangible one. The Underground Railroad, once a bustling network of safe houses and secret routes leading to freedom, began to slow, its operations suffering from a lack of leadership and direction. The fear of betrayal, of being compromised, became all-consuming. In the absence of Anderson's clear directives, many felt exposed. Even the abolitionists who had remained committed to the cause began to question whether they should continue to risk their lives in the same way. Some even suggested that the effort had become too dangerous, that it might be time to retreat from the work that had defined so many lives for so long. The future of the abolitionist movement, once filled with hope and optimism, now seemed uncertain and fraught with doubt. This sense of collapse wasn't just psychological. It was also practical. The momentum that had once propelled the Underground Railroad and the broader abolitionist movement forward began to slow. Safe houses were abandoned, routes were discontinued, and communications between abolitionists grew more sporadic. The presence of law enforcement and pro-slavery militias grew stronger, and the loss of Anderson's leadership left a gaping hole in their ability to organize and act swiftly. Without a strong, centralized leadership to push back against the increasing opposition, the movement began to fracture into smaller, more isolated cells. Each group continued to fight, but without the cohesive power that had once made them such a formidable force. The mystery of Anderson's disappearance grew darker and more perplexing with each passing day. The sense of loss lingered, but it was no longer just about the absence of a person, it was the loss of a vision, a loss of the belief that victory was achievable. The haunting thought began to take root that perhaps Anderson had simply become overwhelmed by the weight of his own ideals, that he had reached a breaking point and disappeared for reasons beyond anyone's comprehension. Some began to entertain the possibility that Anderson had purposefully stepped away, perhaps even gone into hiding, disillusioned with the direction the movement was headed. But others, particularly those closest to him, refused to accept this. They couldn't reconcile the man they knew with the idea that he would voluntarily retreat from the fight. No, there had to be another explanation, one that was more troubling, more mysterious. As the years stretched on, the mystery surrounding Anderson's disappearance was not just about trying to understand what had happened to him, it became about understanding what it meant for the future of the abolitionist movement. What did it mean for their cause if one of their brightest leaders could be so completely consumed by whatever had overtaken him? What did it mean for their cause if Anderson, with all his intelligence, his passion, and his courage, had vanished without a trace? If they could not even understand what happened to him, how could they continue to fight for something as monumental as the abolition of slavery? The ghost of Anderson's disappearance haunted those who had once stood with him, especially as they tried to continue their work in his absence. It was as if they were moving through life in a haze, their resolve weakened by the unanswered questions that seemed to surround them like a fog. Some still spoke his name in reverence, but it was a name that seemed to carry more sorrow than hope now. Anderson's absence became a metaphor for the larger battle they faced, a battle that was not just about freeing the enslaved, but about holding on to their own sense of purpose and conviction in a world that seemed increasingly uncertain. The years after his disappearance passed, and the abolitionist movement, though still active, was no longer the force it had once been. There were moments of progress, but they were often hard-won, and the victories felt hollow without the sense of unity that had once characterized their cause. The fight for freedom became increasingly fragmented, with different factions of the movement pursuing their own goals and strategies. And yet, no matter how much the movement evolved, the shadow of Elijah Anderson's disappearance never truly lifted. It lingered like a heavy weight, pulling at the hearts of those who had once been so inspired by him. And so, the story of Elijah Anderson became one of isolation, of a man and a movement consumed by uncertainty and fear. His disappearance marked the beginning of a slow collapse, not just of a man, but of an ideal. The fight for abolition, while not over, was forever changed by the absence of the man who had once been its brightest star. The once hopeful leaders and activists were left to pick up the pieces, but in their hearts, they knew something essential had been lost, and that the path forward would never be the same. The mystery of Anderson's vanishing would continue to haunt them, a reminder that even the most steadfast leaders can be swept away by forces beyond their control, and that some mysteries, no matter how hard one tries, may never be solved. The years that followed Elijah Anderson's disappearance were marked by a pervasive silence, one that seemed to settle over the abolitionist movement and the communities that had once been the heartbeat of his cause. It was as though the very act of discussing Anderson's vanishing had become taboo, a conversation that was not meant to be had. His name, once spoken with reverence and admiration, slowly faded into the shadows, and with it, the urgency that had once defined the movement. For many, the disappearance of such an iconic figure, so deeply entwined with the abolitionist struggle, had left them without answers, and it was easier to pretend that the mystery didn't exist. The silence wasn't just out of respect, it was born out of a shared discomfort, an unwillingness to confront a truth that seemed too impossible to face. In the wake of his disappearance, Anderson's closest friends and allies struggled to make sense of what had happened. They were no longer able to lead the movement with the same passion or clarity that he had brought to their efforts. His absence left them to face a harsh reality: the war for freedom was still ongoing, but they no longer had the moral or psychological anchor that Anderson had once provided. The abolitionists who had once fought side by side with him found themselves navigating a world that had become less certain, less unified. The emotional weight of his disappearance, coupled with the political pressures that continued to mount, took its toll on many. The movement itself, while still active, began to splinter into smaller, more fragmented groups, each trying to carry on the fight in their own way but unable to recapture the unity that Anderson had fostered. Anderson's disappearance also had a profound effect on the towns and communities that had once been his strongholds. The network of abolitionists that had flourished in the years prior to his vanishing now found themselves in a state of disarray. Those who had supported him quietly retreated into their homes, wary of drawing attention to themselves, knowing that the forces opposed to their cause were only growing stronger. The once vibrant meetings, the clandestine gatherings to plan the next steps in the fight for freedom, became fewer and farther between. The fear of being watched, the sense of impending betrayal, began to haunt even the most steadfast abolitionists. The disappearance of their leader, and the lack of closure that followed, left them unsure of who to trust, unsure of whether the very ideals they had fought for were even worth preserving anymore. In the years after Anderson's vanishing, the local communities, particularly those who had once been allies in the abolitionist cause, began to withdraw. There was a collective desire to forget the unsettling events that had surrounded his disappearance and to move on from the grief that his absence had caused. Some in the abolitionist circles tried to keep his memory alive, but they did so quietly, almost as if ashamed to acknowledge the unresolved mystery. For many, the silence became a kind of coping mechanism. The people closest to Anderson did not want to face the reality that they might never know the truth of what had happened to him. So, they pushed the question aside, hoping that, in time, the pain of it would lessen. But the quietness that followed was not peaceful, it was filled with a sense of loss that never quite went away. In some towns, the silence surrounding Anderson's disappearance was exacerbated by the pressure from external forces. Pro-slavery factions, eager to maintain their dominance, sought to stifle any attempts to keep the abolitionist spirit alive. They used their power to suppress any remnants of Anderson's influence, hoping that the disappearance of such a prominent figure would serve as a warning to others who might consider taking up the abolitionist cause. The fear of retaliation, of being branded as a sympathizer, became a real concern for many in the local communities. The heavy hand of oppression was felt not just in the public sphere but in the private lives of those who had once been so outspoken in their support for freedom.